I'm going to introduce you a little bit for the people who are listening to us. You're Sofia Samatar. You are.
Indeed.
You're a novelist, an essayist, and a teacher at the university. Now, which university? I always forget.
I am at James Madison University in Virginia.
In Virginia. And what do you teach to your students?
I teach a variety of things. Sometimes I teach creative writing, but mostly I teach literature. So I teach Arabic literature, African literature, and I also teach a large course on fairy tales.
Very nice, great. We're going to talk mostly to the novelist and the essayist and the creative writing teacher. So it's a large part of your occupations because we are going to talk about the traps of world building today. What is world building, first off? What do you consider world building?
Yeah, what I consider world building. So I think about it as somebody who writes fiction and also nonfiction. When you write nonfiction, if you write an essay, you do research. When you write fiction, especially fantasy, the kind of fiction I like to write, you do world building. So world building is really like the research of speculative fiction or the research of fantasy and science fiction. It's the background that sometimes is not even visible in the finished product, but it's a very important step. I mean, you need it. You need that building in order to have something. Just like if you write an essay, you need to have research. That's your building blocks, to create your product.
Right. When you work on a novel, do you start with an idea of a character or an idea of the world, an idea of an intrigue, or everything at the same time?
So, yeah, that's a great question. I am a very image-based writer. When I write, I usually begin with an image. I will see something. For example, a young man walking down a street in a strange city who suddenly is confronted with a ghost. This is like, the kind of the key image of a stranger in Alondria. So usually I begin with an image, and I really, for me, creative writing is almost like thinking with images. It's a kind of a thought, it is a thought process. Sometimes people like to say, oh, it's very unconscious and I don't think, I just write. I don't really see it that way. I think it is thinking, but it is thinking with images. You're actually using the images in the way that you would use if you were making an argument. You would use, statements and ideas. In fiction, you're using images in that way. So for me, before I have anything else, I have an image. Often I'm not sure where it comes from, but I have learned that what I need to do is follow that image. I have to, and if I stay close to it and I stay true to that image, then I usually will be happy with the result.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I think one of the main characteristics of your writing is that it is not entirely based on the images. There is a lot of smell, of taste, of music, poetry, and so on. All the other five senses, they come after the image. Do you put them on the image? Do you work them after on the final draft or somewhere in between?
Wow, that's wonderful. Well, at first, I'm very happy that you see this in my work. It is something that's very important to me to involve the senses, not only vision, but all the senses in my writing. It is something I often talk to my students about, my creative writing students. In my comments, I might ask, I might point out, oh, here you have a scene, and, we don't know what the weather is. Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it raining? Those things are very important because I think that, what art is expressing to me. And I have had many different thoughts about this in my life. So this is just my thought right now. Maybe tomorrow it will be different. But right now, I think of art as the expression of consciousness. And your consciousness includes, of course, your ideas, your emotions, all of those things. It also includes your body. So your consciousness includes what you see, what you hear, what you smell. And when I have that initial image, that first image that I see, although I do see it as visual, it often suggests other elements of the senses. So when I explore that image, that's when I discover, okay, if I see this young man, where is he? What is his state of mind? And as it happens, his state of mind is that he went to a festival and he got very drunk and he's very kind of, disoriented and disturbed, and he's in a kind of dirty, confusing place that he doesn't know. So all of those, that's where the other senses begin to come in. And it comes at the moment of writing. It really comes in the first draft, that maybe the image was before I started putting pen on the paper. But once I begin and I'm really exploring it, then I need to feel its whole atmosphere. And the atmosphere includes all of those other senses. So yeah, it's not something, for me, it's not something that can wait until a later draft. It has to happen right away.
Indeed. Uh, so, do you think that first writing about everything else at the purely visual is the first step into the world building for you?
In my case, it was not the first step. I mean, well, let me revise. It was the image was there first, but when I started writing, I did not begin with writing that image. I had a process, again, sort of like it would be a research process if you were writing an essay. And so for me, it was a deliberate world building process before I started writing my first book. And I spent 3 months on world building. And I gave myself a deadline of 3 months.
Yeah.
I said, you cannot do more than 3 months before you begin writing the novel. Why? Because before I wrote the novel, I was in graduate school and I was doing research with many people, working on their doctorate. And I saw people who fell into this kind of research hole where they couldn't stop doing research and they needed to read another book and another book. And oh, but what about this scholar I didn't read? And what about this idea I don't have? And these people were in school for 10 years, 12 years. I mean, they couldn't get out, they couldn't get out of school because they couldn't finish, they couldn't produce the dissertation. So because world building is like research, I knew, okay, I don't want to make that mistake. I cannot make that mistake of just world building forever, and I will never write my novel. So I made it a distinct period of 3 months. And in those 3 months, it was a lot of fun, actually. It was a lot of fun. I wrote the background. I just worked on the background of Alondria. I drew the map. I made lists of the different cities. What kind of terrain is surrounding this city? What is the climate? What products do they make? So what do they eat in that city? How do they make money? What do they trade? What is the patron god or goddess of that city? Who are they worshiping in that city? What is the cult? What are the traditions? What is the political structure? Is it an independent city? Is it a colonized city? Um, all of these, and what about the surrounding, the farms and the different parts of the Alondrian Empire, because it's a huge empire, and also the Tea Islands, which is where my main character Jevik is from. Um, what is the climate there, and what do they eat, and what are their traditions? I also wrote the Alondrian Holy Book, which,
Completely.
yes, which no one
Oh,
has seen except me. It is,
I didn't
I
know.
mean, yeah, written, it's maybe 100 pages of my very small handwriting. I've never typed it. I don't know how long it is, but it is the foundational text of the Alondrian religion. It doesn't, you know, again, nobody has read it except me and the Alondrians, I guess. um, but it doesn't need, its role, just like background research, its role is not to be published. Its role is to be this kind of foundation for the book. So when my characters make a reference to a goddess, I know the history of that goddess. I know how she's related to the other gods and goddesses. I know what she's in charge of. I know her area of control. I know why you would pray to that goddess. So it has a meaning when the character says that. Now, for the reader, they a reader comes upon this as like it's this strange, weird place, which is what we want in a fantasy. We want that feeling of going to some strange place. But I believe that this underlying structure can actually be felt by a reader. I think it's different than if I just made up, oh, the goddess of cabbages or something, at random and just threw it in. I don't think that it would be as strong. Now, I'm the writer, I'm not the reader, so this is a guess. Maybe the reader, maybe it means nothing and makes no difference. But for me, I feel that there is, this underlying structure to the way that my characters are thinking and believing, and it affects their behavior. And I feel that it creates something more coherent than if, I didn't have it.
Yeah, Korean. First, I want to meet the cultist of the goddess of cabbages. And secondly, you say the coherence is important. Do you think it's important, especially in the way you're writing, or for everybody?
Um, well, for me, I would like to see it in all works of fantasy and science fiction. I really would, because I think that I think as a reader, I get more enjoyment out of things that feel coherent. I mean, when I read a fantasy or science fiction, I want to go somewhere. I want to go to a place and I want to feel like I'm really in this place. So if I have the feeling that you just, some character swears something, for example, like by the great mountain, whatever. Well, I want you to know what the great mountain is. And I want to feel like I want it to feel real. And actually, this is, a strange thing about this kind of fiction, that realism is so important.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same thing.
Right?
Fantasy is so close to realism.
Yes.
It's
And in fact, it's more important if you write a realist novel, you have a shared world already with the reader. You can all depend on it together. If you say the man went down the street to the bank, okay, your reader has everything. They know, they have ideas of what a bank is. There's nothing you need to establish there. In fantasy, um, when you send somebody, to Mount Doom or whatever it is, your reader, you don't have a shared reality. You
Yeah.
have to make the reality. And that's why the realism is actually more important. In fact, it's easier to do in realist fiction. It's easier to do like a modernist experiment, like a James Joyce, for example. Well, he can do all kinds of crazy things with his language because we know where Dublin is. And so he can do things that are, so strange. In a fantasy, it actually is very difficult. And I found that interesting because I love, experimental writing. And I would have liked my fantasy to be even more experimental than it was. But I realized like it's just too confusing. It needs a certain very strong realism in order to function, really.
Yeah. Even the sentence, the man goes to the bank, in fantasy, it can be something completely different.
Yes.
The bank of what? The bank of souls or something.
Right, right. Yeah.
Or something. So coherence is important. It's important to have stop the research at one moment. Very important, and it's the first trap. You go too far, and can your word become too coherent?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I love do you know the writer M. John Harrison?
Yeah, a
Yeah,
little
he's
bit,
great.
not a lot, but I read some.
Yeah, he's really interesting, very interesting writer. And he has this great, it's actually a short story. And it's about this group of some kind of strange sort of writing group that have these meetings, and you realize that this is very weird and fantastical, like it's not a normal writing group. But one of the ideas they have in this writing group is that every world that we construct must have some gap. It must have some inconsistency. Um, because perfection is dead. Perfection is closure. It's closed, it's dead. It doesn't feel alive. It feels like it doesn't move. It's static. And so, when I think about this, I also think of like, when I was in Uzbekistan, and learning something about embroidery, the embroidery and the beautiful kind of carpets and hangings that they make. I was told that every pattern, when you make an embroidery pattern, there has to be also a flaw. There has to be some mistake. You don't want a perfect
Yeah,
pattern. Yeah. And the way it was explained to me there was that if you make it too perfect, then somebody will be envious of you and like you'll get the evil eye or something. But I think of it in a different way. I think of it as when you have this perfect pattern and then you have a flaw, it's almost like you have included the possibility of change. And so you have included time.
yeah,
If you just have this motionless perfect system, time doesn't exist. There's no change, nothing moves. And so when I think about this as a fiction writer, yes, you can't breathe in a world where everything is closed. And also, strangely, if it's too consistent, and I talk to my students about this, it's hard to understand because my students tend to want it like everything perfect, very, very consistent. If it's too consistent, it will not feel real because reality is not consistent. it will feel like somebody wrote this, somebody made it up, and they made this perfect world, because we know that reality is messy and it's not perfect. So yeah, I think it's like, I think it's deadly to to world building to have it too perfect.
You're talking mostly about fantasy once they exist. I was thinking about science fiction and especially hard science. Hard
Mm.
science seems to be very closed, very perfect. Everything is a reason, everything is scientific, everything is laws, rules, and so on. Do you think it is possible to have this gap in hard science, for example? So you write science fiction too. I know it. I'm translating something science fiction from you. What are your thoughts about this?
Um, yes, I think it's possible in science fiction. And the reason that it's possible is that a science that is very exact and depends on law, and the laws function the same way every time. This is the universe of Isaac Newton. This is not the universe where we live now. And certainly for science fiction, which is looking at the future, it has to include these questions that we don't understand. Because when you get out of the Newtonian world, in other words, when things become very, very small, like subatomic particles, or they become very, very big, like a black hole, suddenly your laws are not working anymore. Everything starts to become strange. There are so many things we don't understand. The laws of nature break down when you're very small or very large. And often hard science fiction is concerned with those things, with the nature of matter, the nature of reality, those tiny particles, or with the exploration of space and dark matter. What is that? We don't know. So so there's a lot of room for strangeness and contradiction in hard science fiction. And in fact, if you have a work of hard science fiction that is not going to be in a Newtonian space, I don't know how you could even make it perfect, because the science is crazy. Like the science is, it becomes like, I feel like they have a new particle every day. I'm like, every day they just found a new particle and named it. Well, how many of these particles are there? We don't know. And I will go again. It's strange. I'm coming back to M. John Harrison again. And I did not mean for this to be like a conversation about M. John Harrison, but his trilogy, he has a trilogy. The first book is Light. There's Light, and then Nova Swing and Empty Space. This is a hard science fiction trilogy, and it is about, it is about sort of this kind of physics, like particle physics. And if you read this trilogy, I hope you will explain it to me, because I read it and I'm like, what is happening? It's beautiful. It's wonderfully written, and it is very hard science fiction. But because it is taking the science so seriously, there are all kinds of paradoxes and just such strange things are happening, and it's very confusing to me, but I love it.
Right. Let's go back to the traps of world building. One I've noticed with my students, it's difficult when the world building is very big, very precise, and so on, to put a character in it and to have that freedom of the character, freedom to make his or its own decisions, or sorry, the own decisions. Do you have that feeling too? Do you have experiences about that too?
Yes. It is the reason that when I wrote A Stranger in Alondria, the first draft is twice as long as the final draft. So the first draft is double in length what was published. Why? Why was it so long? Because I was giving my characters this freedom. They were wandering around from place to place. Why? I don't know. They were discovering, they were having conversations. So many things happened. And later, then I spent 2 years writing the first draft. Then I spent 10 years cutting because really for the book, it was not necessary to have all of these things, but it was necessary to write them because this gave that feeling of freshness and the unexpected to the character, and to me. Because as a writer, if I know exactly what is going to happen, I mean, I may have a vague idea of what will happen. But if I know exactly what's going to happen, it's dead. Why write it? I have no reason to write that book. I can only write the book that is a mystery, and I don't know where it's going, and I don't know exactly what will happen. So yeah, but I don't, it's hard to think of like, what is the method to do that without taking 12 years, which is very long. It's too long for me. I don't have enough time. I don't want to spend 12 years writing another book. So that's a bit difficult, but I do feel that with writing, sometimes there's no shortcut. Sometimes there's no shortcut. It takes the time it takes. You just have to do it. And when you throw that work away, and I threw away, 300 pages,
Yeah.
it's not wasted. It's not wasted because the work has, seeped into the book. The work has entered the book and enriched the book, even though, the pages themselves you had to throw away.
Indeed. And while world building a book, do you have sometimes fear or to write a travel guide instead of a novel, if I can say, to write something where, oh my God, and now we see that monument and not know that very important person, and to lose the intrigue in it and to be more like a travel guide than a novel with an intrigue.
Yes. In fact, that was the problem with the first draft of A Stranger in Alondria, that it was like a travel guide. And at one point, and I worked on this book, I worked on it for so long, and I kept rewriting it, and I was trying at that time to get an agent because I wanted to publish it. And I was sending it to agents, and it was being rejected again and again. And I did that for 5 years. I sent this book to agents and it kept being rejected. So it was a very depressing time. And at one point, I asked my husband, Keith Miller, who's also a writer and a very good reader, and he's always my first reader. I asked him, like, what? And he read many drafts of the book. So I was like, what is happening? And he said, do you want me to make you a picture, draw you a picture of your book in the air? I said, yes, please. He said, okay, here's your book. So at the beginning, very interesting. At the end, very interesting. In the middle, there's all of this, like, it is a travel book. It's like the travel guide to Alondria. You go to all these cities, but nothing is happening that is actually advancing the story. You're just wandering around. And so the reader begins to wonder, why should I turn the page? And this is, something that I think about. A reader needs, and I know this, I'm a reader, I'm a big reader. I need a reason to turn the page. And especially when a chapter ends, if there's no reason for me to go to the next chapter, maybe I won't go. Maybe I'll do something else. So it's a balancing act, because you need those descriptions that we started talking about. You need the atmosphere and the sensory, experience, but it should be balanced with, a certain rhythm of the pace so that it doesn't get just, too slow. And I in the end, I achieved something I'm happy with and I like it. But actually, my books are too slow for many readers. Many people are like, why so many words? So it's not for everyone, but for me, it reached a balance that I'm happy with. I had another friend who read the book and gave me some very good advice. And she said, she's a writer also. She said, every scene should achieve something. And I was like, what? Really? Yes. Every scene should achieve something. Now, it doesn't mean that every scene, the character discovers something new that will change his life. No, it might be a scene that alters his relationship with another character. It might be a scene that, deepens his knowledge of himself. But something, if you have a scene and you can't explain like what happened to change, what changed after this scene, probably that scene should go. And I think that was good advice.
Indeed. I will try to remember it. It will be a very good point for my own students too. So, okay. I wanted to talk about the influence of the world building. That's something very important, and the literary style of the book, the way you write it, the tone. You wrote a book called Tone with Kate Zambrano, which I hope will be translated in French one day. Uh, so how does one influences the other?
They should, and this is what I always tell my students, they should be woven together so that you could never take them apart. The world building and the story should be almost one. I mean, they should be inextricable one from the other. Because again, this is where writing fantasy or science fiction is different from writing realist fiction. If you write realist fiction, you did not choose this world. You were just born here. You did not make it. You just arrived. And then, so the story you tell is just a story in the world where you arrived. But if you make a world, if you're now making the effort to create a world, why? Why are you doing that? It's because there is a story that can only be told within this world. Otherwise, you might as well just set your story in the real world that you share with other people. So then the reason that you made this world and the features of this world and the elements of this world, they have to be connected to the story that you are telling here in this world. So if I think about A Stranger in Alondria, this really is a book about literature, right? It's a book about reading, and it's a book about books. And therefore, the fact that this main character comes from a place without writing, and he travels to Alondria, which is the land of books, where they have a highly literate culture, that world building is important for the story that is being told. This story needs this world in order to come to life. Now, I don't think that you always need to know the connection from the beginning. Maybe not. I think it's okay to write something because you like it.
Mm.
It's good enough to start. It's good enough to start. Now, later, when you are working more on the book and you're revising, you will discover why. Because something made you create that world and something made you tell this story. So there must be some connection. But maybe in the beginning, you don't know what it is. You're just like, I thought this was cool. And I did it because I like it. Fine, no problem. But when you're revising and you let other people read it, it's good to try to discover what is that connection, because then you can make it stronger. When you revise, you might say, maybe in the beginning, I didn't know why this story in this place, but by the time I finish, now I know. Okay, now it's time to go back and revise and strengthen the connection between the world and the story.
So maybe one of the traps of world building is making all the world building before the writing and not in between or after the writing.
Yes, absolutely. Because you really want them to grow together. And that's why I gave myself that cutoff. I mean, that's not why. This is a beautiful idea that you just said. I did not have this idea in my head at the time. My idea was just, I want to write the book. I don't want to take too long. But what you're saying is so true, because one of the things that you achieve from this, doing the two together, is that they can grow together and they can influence each other as you go. So I did my 3 months, then I started writing the book, but I was also still doing world building. I still would go, I would write my story, but then I could also go to my notes and be saying, okay, here's something. Maybe I had the character just randomly, I don't know, something came into my head and I said, oh, I like that. He ate, I don't know, bread made out of chestnuts. Oh, interesting. So then I put that in my notes. Okay, in this place where he is right now, they use chestnuts more than wheat. So chestnuts are in the bread or whatever it is. They can go back and forth, and they can kind of complement and reinforce each other.
That I didn't know I had ideas.
It was a very great point.
uh, well, I want to talk a little bit more about the tone, the style, the literary adjustment of the book. Um, Writing beautiful sentences is one thing, but in the structure, does the world building influence the structure of a book? For example, a book in the city, I
Mm.
noticed the structure is, I can't say all of the time, but most of the time the same, even if the authors are different. There is always a discovery, a mystery, something we didn't see, and then come and a twist at the end. En gros. Do you think one influences the other? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think we can do differently, or we
My,
must do differently?
yeah, my hope and my idea uh would be that every work of literature takes me to a completely different place. And there, I mean all of them, whether it's realist or it's fantasy or science fiction, but especially in fantasy and science fiction, I expect you to take me as the reader, someplace I have never been. And the very best, and this is rare, but the best is when you take me somewhere that I want to go again.
Yeah.
For me, the real test of a book, whether I love it, is have I read it more than once? Now, if a story is just about the intrigue, the plot, the twists, and it doesn't have anything else to make it a special place that I can only find in this book, why should I read it again? Now I know what happened. I know the twists. I can't be surprised again. To me, this is it's not that it's not like a sin. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it is a consumptible literature. You eat it and that's it. You're finished.
Yeah.
But what I love and what I want is a book that is like a place and a world that is like no other world, and a world where I want to be for reasons other than the intrigue and the plot, so that I will read it again. And there are many books that I will read. I just reread Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. I
Great
mean,
choice.
I've been reading this book since I was 12 years old or something, and I've read it many times. I know what happens very well, but I can always go again. Why? Because this planet of winter is a place, and this is where I think we start to get into what I think of as tone. The tone, the atmosphere, the way the novel is constructed, but also, the world of the novel. Everything about the way it is put together is winter. It is the planet of winter. And there is no other book that has that. So if I want to go to that planet, I have to read that book again. And I think that, this is why it feels maybe I'm a bit unsatisfied with the kind of book you describe, where it starts to feel like, I've seen this before. I could go here in another book. And the difference between these books is that there are different characters and different plot twists. For me, that's not enough. I need it. If it's really what I think of as world building, you made a place that does not exist outside of this book. And that is what I think is a real achievement. And for me as a reader, I'm always looking for that.
I love this idea of book as places.
Yeah.
It's you
Yeah.
okay, we still have 15 minutes. I wanted to talk about the why of the world building, of the importance of the world building. Nowadays, I'm under the impression that world building for most people is everything. And I was thinking about the history of our literatures, and I was wondering, where does it come from? Because we have very, very precise things in the book of the Old Master. I'm thinking about Tolkien, for example, which is too much more building for me, to be honest, but which is the example of world building with the new languages and everything. Do you think it's an historical uh, substrate that we we give so much importance to the world building in terms of something very precise with very precise things. And I read the book and can write the map of the world, even if it's unnecessary.
Yeah, I think that well, I think you're right to look at Tolkien, because this genre, as a contemporary genre, really comes from Tolkien. That's the root of it. Not, of course, before that, people told stories about strange countries, but this particular contemporary genre does begin with Tolkien. And I think for me, I think I agree with you, first of all, that there's a bit of a problem. It's a bit of a problem when people are so focused on world building and they forget that this is literature. You're not building with Legos. Like it's not so, mechanical as I choose the world, I choose the things, I make it's a novel. And I think for me, I think one of the problems is actually a misreading of Tolkien. Because I think what happens when people look at Tolkien is that his work on world building was so immense that it overwhelms people. And all they can see is like, oh, all of this, work. And they miss the other things that are happening in Tolkien. And some of the things that I think are important in Tolkien that I don't see, uh, I don't think the focus is on these things. One thing about Tolkien is that Tolkien never took a creative writing class. He didn't even really think of himself as a creative writer. And so, I mean, he wrote The Hobbit. The Hobbit was just for his kids. He wrote The Lord of the Rings. When you read it, you can see he's not thinking about like the character arc for each person or, the construction of the plot. So what's happening? How did he write it? My feeling, my sense from reading him is that he wrote it because he saw it. It was so vividly in his mind that it was like it was real to him. And those things really happened. And so he just wrote them. So one of the things people are missing about Tolkien is an intensity of vision that he had with that story, that you cannot get that intensity of vision from making your world building chart. It's a completely different process. Another thing that I think people miss is Tolkien's language. Not that he made Elvish and all the different dialects, but his English. And the fact that in The Lord of the Rings, he puts together very different forms of English. There is a very humble, cozy, sweet, very colloquial kind of dialect language of the hobbits. And there is a very high, epic narration, especially in The Return of the King, where it starts to sound like, the Bible or Beowulf or some, epic text. And there's a lot of energy and contrast in bringing together those different tones. It's very, very powerful. So I think, everybody or many people, most people, and especially people who read fantasy, recognize that Tolkien is great. And why? Well, they start saying because he made all these books and he made all these languages and he made this great map. But actually, it's a lot about his language use. That's really what we're enjoying when we're reading Tolkien. And I wish that I wish that the genre had taken that, as well as taking the idea of the complicated, detailed world building. I wish they had taken the idea of the extremely powerful vision and the complex and rich use of English. I think we would have a different genre if we focused on those things rather than, the details of the map.
I think so. I think another influence that was mentioning is role-playing games too. role-playing games are mostly based, at least the books are mostly based on a world, of course, world building, and so on. And I think the video games too, and so on, which is something logical for a game because you are the main character, but which is also, there is so many people who write books that come from role playing that you can smell it in the way they work.
It's a tone.
Yeah, indeed, completely, completely. Well, we have 5 more minutes. Did I miss something?
No, I mean, this is a wonderful conversation. I would, I had a question for you,
Yeah,
about a book. Have you read the book Mordu by Alex Phoebe?
not at all. I
This is,
should.
I believe, it's an English writer. Can I use the chat? I will, let's see. Because to put the spelling, um, this is a recent book. I believe it's a trilogy, but I've only read the first one. And it's one of the like new contemporary examples of world building that I've seen that I think is pretty fantastic. I think it's a really good book. It's really interesting. It is a strange urban, very decayed
Yeah.
kind of atmosphere, and young protagonists. These kids are in this kind of, um is it a slum? I don't know. It's just a very, I mean, it's the city itself is actually the body of a dead god.
Oh, great.
So a god has died, and his decaying body is now the city that the people are living in. It's really interesting. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that to you and anybody else who might be interested. Yeah, it's some contemporary world building that I read it and I thought, wow, I haven't seen something like this in a while. It's an example of what I mean when I say,
Yeah,
here's a place I don't think it exists anywhere else.
very interesting. We're gonna put it in the YouTube comments for everybody to
Okay,
see
good. Good.
forever, forever with all the possibilities. Maybe it will be translated in French one day. Who knows?
I hope so. I hope so. Yes, I think it would do well. It's very good.
One I really like, and I talked to you about it uh, 1 year ago because I translated it. It's the book from Simon Jimenez. I forgot, and now I forget the.
I know. And you told it's still on my list. I haven't read it yet, but I
And
know
what
I
I
want
like
to.
is the structure and the literary style and everything is really strange based on a world we could see maybe somewhere else because it's a fantasy world with an emperor, with some goddess, and so on, and everything is completely changed just by the style, which is a part of the world building, I think,
Mm.
because it's the story of a story of a story of a ballet in a theater, which tells the story actually, and
Wow, that's great.
everything is intertwined uh, just because of the style, and the style is as much a part of the world building, I think, in it than the world building itself.
Yes.
Uh, Yeah, I think it's a great book. It's one of the best I ever read, and I'm really proud to have translated it. And I
That's
don't say
wonderful.
that because I translated it, because it broke my mind in a thousand pieces.
That's
Really.
great. Yes, I need to read that. And when we're thinking, because I mentioned Ursula Le Guin,
Yeah.
when we're thinking about style and world building, something she does in The Left Hand of Darkness, which is also even more in Always Coming Home, is that she is putting her world building into the novel as stories. So, you read a chapter that is what about the character and what's happening to the character. And the next chapter is a creation myth. And then you
Ah,
go back to the narrative. So because you have that's also a way of putting the different tones and different styles into the novel, because the creation myth has a language that is different from, the character's diary or the character just talking about his life. And I think that's a really wonderful and powerful. Kim Stanley Robinson did it, to give a science fiction example, in 2312. So the novel 2312, in between the chapters are just pieces of writing, of text from this science fiction world. And it could be anything. It could be a history, it could be an instruction manual, it could be anything, but it's inserted into the book, almost taking the world building and putting it inside the text. It's a method that I enjoy. Yeah, I think it works well.
another one I like really much is the footnotes in the books of Jack Vance. All the footnotes are
Love
world building.
footnotes.
They're funny, but they're world building indeed every time, really. And it gives that realism. So we were
Yes,
talking before, like when you read a contemporary Japanese book and there is a note and so on. And it's very, very subtle, I think, on this interconnection between style and realism and
yes,
world
yes,
building.
yes, yes. I love that. When I talk to my students, I often call it a reality effect. So rather
Yeah,
than calling it realism, because we're not really doing realism, but I say we are always looking for that reality effect, that will give us the feeling, and having the feeling that you just discovered this text inside the world. That's a great approach, and I think a great method to achieve that reality effect.
great. Well, we will end on this reading recommendations. So thank you very much, Sophia.
Thank
Uh,
you.
we will see again. We will meet again Sunday at
Yes.
2:30 p.m. European time. And we will be talking, I think, about books, translation, and tone, because you wrote a book about it, and it's one of my passions too. So
Great.
we're gonna talk about it. Thank you very much. See
Thank
you
you.
Sunday.
Looking forward